The phone was cold. Not metaphorically. Literally cold, like it had been waiting in the dark too long. It rang once. Then again. Then stopped. Outside, Houston slept the sleep of people who believed their pensions were safe. Inside the upper floors of the Enron headquarters, the air smelled of burnt coffee, toner, and something else, fear, metallic and dry, like blood on the tongue. The building hummed, not with confidence, but with electricity that no one trusted anymore. A man stood barefoot on the carpet, tie discarded like a shed skin. His shirt clung to his back. Sweat glued it there. He hadn't noticed when it happened. Hours ago, maybe days. Time had started to fold in on itself. The monitors were still on. Numbers glowed green and red, blinking with the calm indifference of machines that had not been told the party was over. Futures. Options. Contracts that promised power plants, pipelines, profits that stretched years into a future that now felt like a bad joke. Outside the glass walls, the city lights flickered. Inside, the illusion finally cracked. The phone rang again. He picked it up this time. The plastic pressed into his palm, unforgiving. The voice on the other end didn't bother with greetings. They pulled the credit line. A pause. Somewhere, water dripped. A leaky pipe. Or maybe an air conditioner dying quietly, like everything else in the building. How long? He asked. Immediate. The word landed heavy. Immediate meant now. Immediate meant tonight. Immediate meant that by morning, there would be no more pretending. He looked around the office. Leather chairs. Abstract art that cost more than most people's houses. A framed magazine cover on the wall, declaring a revolution in energy, innovation, intelligence. He wondered, briefly, who had written the headline and whether they were sleeping well. The phone slipped slightly in his grip. Cold metal. Cold truth. Down on the trading floor, someone laughed. A sharp, brittle sound. Black humor had a way of surfacing right before impact. Someone else swore. A chair scraped back hard enough to hurt someone's shin. The sound of a keyboard smashing keys too fast, like confession through numbers. This was not how collapse was supposed to feel. No explosion. No sirens. No police tape. Just silence spreading through glass and steel. He remembered a line from a presentation years ago. A joke, really. We don't trade energy, the executive had said, smiling. We trade risk. Tonight, risk had finally learned how to bite. The man walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass. It was cool. Comforting. 30 floors below, traffic lights changed on schedule, obedient, unaware. Somewhere out there, employees were sleeping, dreaming of bonuses that no longer existed, of retirement accounts already bleeding out. Inside the building, printers whirred to life. Paper spilled out, reports, confirmations, documents that suddenly felt like evidence. Somewhere, someone would soon decide what to keep and what to destroy. Ethics always got very flexible when survival entered the room. The phone rang again. This time, he didn't answer. Because he already knew what the voice would say. By morning, the company would be worth less than the paper it printed its lies on. By morning, the word innovation would be replaced with fraud. By morning, everyone would claim they had no idea. He closed his eyes. The lights flickered once more. And in that brief darkness, the greatest energy company in America quietly ran out of power. Do you believe numbers tell the truth? Not opinions. Not memories. Numbers. Because everyone in that building believed they did. They had trusted spreadsheets more than faces, models more than voices, projections more than consequences. Numbers didn't sweat. Numbers didn't hesitate. Numbers didn't wake up at night wondering who would pay the bill. And yet, somewhere between the third decimal place and the footnotes no one read, the numbers had learned how to lie. This is where the comfortable version of the story usually begins. A morality tale. Greedy executives. Naive investors. A system that failed. It's neat. It fits in a headline. It's also wrong. The truth is harder to digest and much less flattering. Because this story isn't about criminals hiding in the shadows. It's about people standing in bright conference rooms, pointing at charts, and being applauded for it. It's about a culture that didn't break the rules, it rewrote them, then charged admission. And tonight, as the lights flickered inside Enron, one question finally surfaced, too late to matter. What if everyone knew? Not suspected. Not guessed. Knew. The idea moved through the building like a draft. Uncomfortable. Unspoken. Dangerous. For years, the company had been praised as brilliant. Visionary. Too complex for ordinary minds. Analysts nodded thoughtfully on television, pretending they understood things they were paid not to question. Reporters repeated phrases like innovative accounting without laughing, which in hindsight feels almost heroic. And the employees? They watched their stock options grow and told themselves that doubt was just jealousy in a cheaper suit. Success has a way of anesthetizing curiosity. But numbers are patient. They wait. They accumulate. They don't forgive. Behind the glass offices and motivational slogans, a simple transformation had taken place. A company that once sold actual energy had learned it could sell something far more profitable. Expectation. They sold tomorrow. Then the day after. Then futures stacked on futures, until the present didn't matter anymore. Profit appeared instantly. Loss was postponed indefinitely. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it was a time bomb with excellent branding. And the most dangerous part? It worked. Until it didn't. Because somewhere deep inside the reports, buried under optimism and jargon, the math began to suffocate under its own weight. Reality started knocking. Quietly at first. Then louder. Then all at once. This is the moment people imagine someone standing up, clearing their throat, and saying, "We should stop." That moment never came. What came instead were bonuses. Promotions. Magazine covers. A standing ovation from markets that loved growth and hated questions. And so the question changed. Not is this real? But how long can we keep this alive? The answer, as it turns out, was measured not in years, but in nights. And one of those nights had already begun. They didn't look like villains. That was the first mistake. No trench coats. No whispered threats. No backroom smoke thick enough to choke a conscience. The men at the top of Enron looked like the future had personally endorsed them. Jeffrey Skilling walked fast. Always fast. Long strides down polished corridors, jaw tight, eyes forward, as if stopping might allow doubt to catch up. His suits were expensive but practical. No wasted fabric. No wasted time. He spoke in sharp sentences, trimmed of empathy. Markets were efficient. People were not. That was not cruelty. That was math. Skilling believed in intelligence the way others believed in God. And like many believers, he assumed those who disagreed simply weren't smart enough. Then there was Kenneth Lay. Lay smiled. Not the rehearsed grin of a salesman, but something warmer, almost pastoral. He spoke softly, leaned in when you talked, remembered your children's names. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and reassurance. The kind of men politicians trusted and pastors admired. He liked to talk about values. Faith. Responsibility. He also liked not knowing details. Because details complicated things. Lay was the father of the company. Skilling was its mind. And neither wanted to look too closely at its hands. Those belonged to Andrew Fastow. Fastow dressed carefully. Conservative suits. Perfectly knotted ties. He laughed when expected, nodded when required. His handshake was slightly damp. Always slightly damp. He lived in the footnotes, in the margins, in structures so complex they looked impressive simply because no one wanted to admit they didn't understand them. Fastow didn't sell vision. He sold explanations. And explanations, when delivered confidently, could make almost anything disappear. Together, they formed the holy trinity of modern corporate worship. Vision. Credibility. Execution. Investors adored them. Analysts praised them. The press called them pioneers. Enron wasn't just an energy company anymore, it was an idea. A platform. A philosophy. They said Enron was about freeing markets. What they meant was freeing themselves from consequences. Inside the company, this belief trickled down. Young traders wore arrogance like cologne. Offices buzzed with caffeine, ambition, and a low-level contempt for anyone who asked slow questions. Risk was celebrated. Caution was career suicide. Performance reviews were brutal. You were either a star or already dead. People learned quickly which instincts to silence. Doubt didn't get promoted. At night, the city outside glowed. Inside, spreadsheets multiplied. Profits appeared instantly, as if summoned. No waiting. No patience. The future was dragged into the present and counted as a win. Someone once joked in a meeting, reality just hasn't caught up yet. Everyone laughed. Black humor ages well when it's accurate. Because beneath the confidence, beneath the bravado, something fragile had formed. A system that required belief more than verification. A machine that had to keep moving, because stopping meant looking. And none of the golden boys wanted to look. Skilling trusted the math too much. Lay trusted the people too much. Fastow trusted himself too much. And somewhere between those certainties, the truth began to suffocate quietly, politely, waiting for its turn. No one noticed. They were too busy winning. And winning, as it turns out, makes an excellent blindfold. The room smelled like dry erase markers and confidence. A glass-walled conference room. A long table. Coffee cups abandoned halfway through belief. On the screen, a curve rose upward, smooth and obedient, the kind of line that made executives relax their shoulders. Jeffrey Skilling stood at the head of the table and didn't pace. Pacing suggested uncertainty. He pointed instead. Calm. Precise. This, he said, tapping the projection, is reality. The rest is accounting. No one laughed. They nodded. The idea was simple enough to explain in a sentence and dangerous enough to collapse a company. Sell the future today. Book the profit immediately. Deal with the mess later. It was called mark-to-market accounting, and in theory, it was legal. In practice, it required imagination. Lots of imagination. You estimated what a long-term contract might earn over years, sometimes decades, then recorded all that profit the moment the deal was signed. If reality disagreed later, well, there were always adjustments. What no one said out loud was that Enron had turned forecasting into fiction. They weren't measuring value. They were inventing it. A power plant in another country that hadn't been built yet. Profit booked. A broadband venture that barely functioned. Profit booked. A market that didn't exist. Especially profit booked. Numbers surged. Bonuses followed. Praise poured in. Over on Wall Street, analysts clapped politely and raised price targets. Some didn't understand the business. Others understood it too well. But skepticism is a lonely position when everyone else is making money. One analyst joked privately, "I don't know how they make it. But it works." That was enough. Inside Enron, the culture shifted subtly, then completely. Earnings were no longer something you earned. They were something you declared. If the declaration was confident enough, reality usually took the hint. Traders learned that bad news wasn't failure, it was poor timing. Delay it. Reframe it. Bury it under something shinier. There was always another deal, another projection, another future to mortgage. At night, spreadsheets glowed like confessionals. Cells filled with assumptions stacked on assumptions, fragile towers of belief that required silence to stand. Someone asked, once, what would happen if the estimates were wrong? Skilling didn't look up. Then the market was wrong, he said. It sounded logical. It sounded modern. It sounded untouchable. And it worked because everyone involved benefited from pretending it would work forever. But markets don't care about confidence. They care about cash. And cash, unlike projections, eventually runs out. Deep inside the numbers, a pressure built. Losses hidden. Debts disguised. Reality pacing outside the glass, patient, relentless. No alarms sounded. No red lights flashed. Just one small adjustment here. Another structure there. A promise that tomorrow would fix today. They were selling the future faster than it could arrive. And somewhere, quietly, tomorrow began to refuse delivery. The paperwork didn't scream. That was the problem. It whispered. Conference rooms filled with binders thicker than common sense. Flowcharts that looked like modern art. Arrows looping back into themselves, money changing names like a fugitive changing passports. If you stared long enough, it almost made sense. If you didn't, it definitely did. Inside Enron, new words entered the language. Structures. Vehicles. Special purpose entities. They sounded harmless. Almost elegant. In reality, they were hiding places. Andrew Fastow became very busy. His calendar filled. His phone never stopped buzzing. He spoke faster now, smiled less. The sweat on his palms was no longer subtle. Complexity had become a shield, and he wielded it expertly. The partnerships had names that meant nothing and everything. LJM. Raptors. Shells designed to absorb losses so Enron didn't have to acknowledge them. Debts were moved off the books, then quietly guaranteed by the very company pretending they weren't there. It was financial ventriloquism. Losses disappeared. Earnings stayed beautiful. Executives slept just well enough. And here was the trick so audacious it bordered on satire. The man responsible for protecting the company's finances was also profiting personally from the structures meant to protect it. Conflict of interest wasn't ignored, it was monetized. Someone in accounting raised an eyebrow. Someone else lowered their voice. A third reminded them how valuable their stock options had become. Questions dissolved. In the hallways, the jokes got darker. If this ever comes out, one employee said over drinks, we'll need matching prison outfits. They laughed. Too loud. Too long. Bars near the office filled each night with nervous energy and expensive whiskey. People talked about exits. About timing. About how long this could last. No one talked about stopping it. Because stopping meant unraveling everything. Documents multiplied. Emails were carefully worded. Verbs softened. Responsibility blurred. The language of deception wasn't dramatic, it was bureaucratic. Passive voice became a survival tool. Mistakes were no longer mistakes. They were temporary timing differences. And timing, they told themselves, was on their side. But rumors don't respect balance sheets. Whispers began leaking outside the building. A reporter asked a question that was a little too specific. An analyst noticed a footnote that didn't quite behave. Inside Enron, the response was not panic. It was acceleration. More structures. More creativity. More confidence. Because once you start lying to reality, the only move left is to lie faster. Somewhere deep in the maze of partnerships, the numbers stopped obeying. They tangled. They contradicted. They waited for someone brave, or foolish, enough to pull the wrong thread. And someone was getting very close. He just didn't know yet how expensive curiosity could be. The email was polite. That was its first mistake. It wasn't angry. It didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It asked questions the way responsible adults are taught to ask them, carefully, respectfully, with footnotes. It was written by someone who still believed the system might correct itself if given the chance. Sharon Watkins sat alone when she sent it. Office lights dimmed. Shoes kicked off under the desk. A yellow legal pad filled with crossed-out thoughts lay nearby, evidence of a conscience negotiating with survival. She had read the numbers, then reread them, then followed them into places numbers should not go. The partnerships didn't behave like independent entities. The guarantees looped back home. The profits depended on assumptions stacked so delicately that a single honest question could collapse the entire structure. This wasn't aggressive accounting. This was a cliff pretending to be a staircase. Watkins didn't call the press. She didn't call regulators. She wrote internally, directly, to the top. Quietly. The way people do when they hope to stay employed. Her message warned that the company could implode in a wave of accounting scandals. The phrasing was careful. Almost gentle. Like describing an oncoming train as inconvenient. She waited. Hours passed. Then days. The response, when it came, was soothing. Meetings were scheduled. Reassurances were offered. Outside consultants were brought in, not to fix the problem, but to examine the framing of it. Inside the building, nothing slowed. No deals were stopped. No structures dismantled. No executives resigned in shame. Instead, the system closed ranks with professional grace. Watkins was thanked. Her concerns were acknowledged. Her access quietly narrowed. This was not punishment. This was containment. In corporate America, truth isn't silenced with force. It's buried under process. Meanwhile, the shredders became more active. The language in emails grew even softer. Exposure replaced loss. Volatility replaced risk. Review replaced panic. People noticed Watkins watching meetings more than speaking. They noticed her name no longer appearing on key threads. No one said anything. Silence, after all, was a learned skill. At night, she lay awake replaying conversations. Wondering if she had done enough, or too much. Wondering how history would phrase her role, if history ever bothered to remember middle managers. She didn't know that elsewhere in the building, contingency plans were already being discussed. Not to fix the company. To survive it. Because by then, the truth was no longer a problem to solve. It was a liability to manage. And somewhere beyond the glass walls and carefully worded memos, the market was beginning to notice that something smelled wrong. Very wrong. Through no fault of her own, the quiet email had become a fuse. And it was already burning. The applause didn't stop right away. That was the strangest part. Outside Houston, the company was still being discussed in confident tones. Television studios glowed. Analysts adjusted their glasses and spoke about temporary volatility. Newspapers ran cautious headlines, padded with optimism like fragile packages. Over on U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission letterhead, questions began to form. Slowly. Carefully. No one wanted to be the first to shout fire in a room full of shareholders. On the trading desks of New York, phones rang with a different rhythm now. Not excitement. Calculation. The kind that comes right before distance. Some analysts noticed that cash flow didn't behave like profit. Others noticed that footnotes were doing heavy lifting normally reserved for reality. A few downgraded the stock and were quietly ignored. Being wrong early feels exactly like being wrong. Inside Enron, executives went on the defensive, wrapped in polished talking points and familiar arrogance. They spoke about innovation. About misunderstanding. About enemies who just didn't get it. They sounded convincing. That was their final talent. Employees watched the coverage on muted televisions in break rooms. Eyes followed ticker symbols crawling across the bottom of the screen. Each red number felt personal now. Someone joked that the stock price was just taking a scenic route. No one laughed. Meetings multiplied. Legal teams appeared more often than traders. Hallways filled with low conversations that stopped when someone unfamiliar passed by. Trust narrowed to small circles. Then smaller. Emails became dangerous. One manager told his team to stop writing anything that could be misunderstood later. Another suggested phone calls. A third suggested nothing at all. Silence, once again, was promoted. Outside, the market began to do what it always does when belief runs out. It asked for proof. Cash. Transparency. Things Enron had traded away long ago in exchange for speed. Credit agencies circled. Banks hesitated. Deals stalled. And just like that, the applause turned into space. Space between calls. Space between promises. Space between what Enron said it was worth and what anyone was willing to pay. The irony was cruel. For years, complexity had protected them. Now it trapped them. No one could explain the company quickly enough to save it. And in markets, confusion is indistinguishable from danger. Inside the building, someone noticed that the elevators felt slower. Someone else realized the cafeteria had stopped restocking certain items. Small signs. Petty signs. The kind collapse announces itself with. This was no longer about accounting. It was about belief. And belief, once cracked, doesn't need much help falling apart. By the end of the week, executives stopped pretending they were misunderstood. They started preparing to be remembered. Because when the questions finally stop being polite, history doesn't ask for explanations. It asks for names. And the silence was about to get very loud. The stock price didn't fall. It gave up. Numbers that once inspired speeches now slid downward without drama, like a body finally letting go. Screens refreshed. Traders stared. Someone whispered a curse that sounded more tired than angry. Inside Enron, the elevators filled with cardboard boxes. Personal items surfaced from desks like artifacts from a forgotten civilization. Family photos. Stress balls. Awards engraved with dates that suddenly felt ironic. People avoided eye contact, as if collapse were contagious. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. Banks wanted clarity. Investors wanted answers. Employees wanted to know if their retirement still existed. No one had good news. In a different building, miles away but morally adjacent, the shredders started early. At Arthur Anderson, the sound was unmistakable. Paper fed into machines with mechanical obedience. Page after page. Audit notes. Drafts. Memos that once felt harmless now felt radioactive. Someone reminded the staff to follow document retention policy. Everyone suddenly remembered what that meant. Back in Houston, executives rehearsed statements that would never be believed. Lawyers adjusted language until responsibility became abstract. Mistakes were collective. Oversight was systemic. Accountability floated, unattached to any one person. Down on the trading floor, screens went dark one by one. Not ceremonially. Just efficiently. Power cut to terminals that no longer mattered. A trader punched his locker hard enough to draw blood. He stared at his knuckles, then laughed quietly. Black humor again. Reliable to the end. All that intelligence, he said to no one. And we forgot to keep the lights on. The bankruptcy filing arrived like a death certificate printed in legal font. The largest in American history at the time. The words were clean. Professional. Devoid of grief. Markets reacted instantly. Trust vanished. Credit evaporated. The company that once claimed to reinvent capitalism couldn't make payroll. Employees were told to go home. Security watched them leave. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters practiced concerned expressions. Questions sharpened themselves. Inside, the building echoed. A cathedral emptied of worshippers. Someone noticed the company slogan still hanging in the lobby. It promised transformation. Innovation. A smarter future. No one bothered to take it down. Because collapse doesn't need symbolism. It writes its own. By nightfall, Enron wasn't a business anymore. It was evidence. And somewhere in the silence left behind, the truth finally had space to breathe, briefly, before lawyers, hearings, and history began to rearrange it. The company was gone. But the consequences were just getting started. Justice arrived slowly. Not with sirens. Not with handcuffs at dawn. But with subpoenas printed on heavy paper and delivered by people who never raised their voices. Courtrooms replaced boardrooms. Wood instead of glass. Flags instead of logos. The language changed, but the habits didn't. Lawyers spoke the way executives once had, confidently, selectively, with a talent for omission. The government called it accountability. The people who lost everything called it late. Prosecutors from the United States Department of Justice laid out timelines that finally moved forward instead of sideways. Emails resurfaced. Testimony contradicted memory. Confidence wilted under cross-examination. The story fractured into individual narratives. Andrew Fastow sat straighter than expected. He spoke carefully now. Cooperation had a price, and he paid it with names. The structures were explained in plain language at last, and stripped of jargon, they sounded exactly like what they were. Fraud doesn't age well when translated into English. Fastow pleaded guilty. He accepted years in prison in exchange for honesty that arrived only after it was safe to be honest. Some called him brave. Others called him efficient. Jeffrey Skilling fought. He wore tailored suits to court, as if professionalism might still negotiate terms with reality. He argued complexity. Intent. Innovation misunderstood by smaller minds. The jury listened. Then they listened harder. Conviction followed. Years behind bars reduced a once untouchable intellect to a case number. Appeals chipped away at the sentence, but not the verdict. History had made up its mind. Kenneth Lay never heard his. He died before sentencing. Heart attack, they said. Some believed it. Some didn't. Death, like bankruptcy, tends to simplify narratives whether it should or not. The trial ended without the catharsis people expect from courtroom dramas. No speech restored the pensions. No verdict returned lost time. The law closed its folders and moved on. Employees watched from living rooms and break rooms, hoping for something that felt like balance. What they got instead was confirmation. The system worked. Just not for them. Executives served time. Firms paid fines. Reforms were promised. Regulations thickened. Everyone agreed lessons had been learned. And yet, the money did not come back. Justice, it turned out, was not a refund. When the cameras left and the transcripts were archived, something lingered in the empty space between guilt and consequence. A discomfort no sentence could address. Because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. And it still wasn't enough. The office towers were empty. Glass reflected nothing but sky. The elevators no longer carried ambition. The carpet smelled faintly of coffee and lost opportunities. Outside, Houston continued. Life didn't pause for collapse. Street lights changed. Cars honked. People argued over trivialities, blissfully unaware that billions had disappeared above their heads. The pensions were gone. Savings vanished. Employees had learned the hard lesson. Trust, when bought and sold as a product, can evaporate overnight. And the executives? They moved on. Some behind bars. Some dead. Some quietly wealthy, having negotiated settlements before the fire reached them. They walked free, leaving behind empty offices and shattered faith. The headlines disappeared. Scandals have half-lives. They're replaced by something newer, faster, shinier. Only historians, auditors, and occasional journalists remembered the name Enron, repeating it like a cautionary spell. Inside the empty lobby, a plaque still hung. Innovation, integrity, excellence. Irony was alive. It didn't care if anyone laughed. No moral lesson waited at the end. No miraculous recovery. Only echoes of decisions, shortcuts, and hubris. Only the weight of numbers that had lied so convincingly they nearly rewrote reality itself. Sometimes, the story leaves a question rather than an answer. Who pays when belief is bought? Who survives when trust is sold? And sometimes, the answer is simple and bitter. Those who built the illusion walk away, while others pay for believing in it. Sometimes truth disappears. Not because it's wrong. Not because it's ignored. But because it was never meant to save anyone. And in the quiet that follows, the city continues, indifferent, watching its next illusion form. Because collapse has a rhythm. And life, like the market, does not wait.